my skylight tote here. I made sure. I don't know if Ken and I know who's going to play the host exactly between us, but is that my foot thing?
That's what King's Hand is for.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, I just kicked it. But anyway, I just want to say I'm thrilled to be here to celebrate Ken's amazing book. So thank you for asking me to be here, Ken.
Of course. I'm hoping that this will work. As you see, my voice is only half here. I'd like to start by thanking Maggie for coming out on the eve of her birthday. I'll have to say happy birthday to her. And it's a real pleasure. What we talked about doing was each of us are going to read briefly from our books and then have a discussion back and forth. We already started our discussion. And I'm going to try this with a Ricola and hot water. I like to think of myself as an obsessive, but it's only made that much better when the hysteric behind the obsessive emerges. That's not going to work. Okay. This is from the very beginning of my book. Have you tried not to think about this at all until today? Yes. Is this really hard for you? Yes. Did you see Brandon when he came into the courtroom this morning? Yes. You saw this person that you saw shoot Larry King? Yes. Yes? Where is he sitting? I know. I'm not going to ask you to look at him, but can you tell me where is he sitting? Behind me. Deep breath. Where? Behind me. Mariah Thompson had come to testify in the People of the State of California versus Brandon David McInerney. 3 years earlier, on February 12, 2008, 14-year-old Brandon shot 15-year-old Larry Phobes King twice in the back of the head during their first period English class at E.O. Green Junior High in Oxnard, California. On this, the second day of the trial, July 6, 2011, Brandon stood accused of first-degree murder, lying in wait, and a hate crime. The hate was said to be gender hate. Larry King had begun referring to himself as a girl a few days before he was killed, and it was alleged by the Ventura County District Attorney that Brandon killed Larry because of his perceived gender or sexual orientation. The bailiff, Los Angeles District Deputy Sheriff Mike Anton, met Mariah at the main door to courtroom F51 of the Superior Court of the State of California, Chatsworth, California. Room F51 was a windowless, though brightly lit sage green box. It had been built for wear. Plastic wood veneers, poorly padded folding seats, concrete floors. Even the sparse carpeting was made to endure, not bounce. Mariah had been a classmate of Larry King and Brandon McInerney and an eyewitness to the shooting. Sheriff Anton offered his hand to guide her to the witness stand. She did not look up as she walked past the visitors' gallery toward the well of the court. Sheriff Anton opened a small gate in the waist-high wall that divided the gallery from the well and gently directed Mariah between the tables used by the prosecution and the defense teams. Wearing a white cotton sundress and black ballet flats, she recoiled even as she advanced, walking with her head bent forward, her shoulders rounded into her round frame. She made no eye contact. She stopped a few feet before the judge's bench. She tugged at the edge of her salmon-colored cardigan sweater. The judge, the Honorable Charles W. Campbell, sat at his imposing bench above Mariah. The clerk of the court, the record keeper, and her assistant sat at a long desk perpendicular to the judge's bench on the right. The court reporter sat just below the judge, not far from where Mariah stood. The jury was seated on a 3-row riser to Mariah's left. Sheriff Anton instructed Mariah to raise her right hand and face the clerk. Mariah did not turn, nor did she look toward the clerk. She did, though, raise her hand barely above her hip. Holding a Bible, Madam Clerk asked, "Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to give in the case now pending before this court is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" Mariah nodded and was sworn in. With Sheriff Anton's help, she made her way up a single step to the witness stand, a small perch sandwiched between the judge's bench and the jury box. She sat hunched on the edge of the brown upholstered chair, the sort one might see in an office cubicle. Sheriff Anton, the unerring butler of the courtroom, ran his hand over the rail as if to demonstrate that Mariah was protected. She stated her first name and spelled it. She looked then, for the first time, out at the room. As Mariah looked out upon the room, I doubt that she took in the 57 people who had gathered before her, for as quickly as she looked up, she lowered her head again and began to weep. Fear illuminated Mariah's pale skin and blue eyes. Deputy D.A. Fox, leading the prosecution, instructed Mariah to breathe. Ms. Fox offered to delay the questioning. She asked if Mariah might like to have one of her parents join her on the stand. Judge Campbell reiterated these offers. Mariah caught her breath and said that she could go on. Led by Ms. Fox's questions, Mariah described Larry King as a skinny-ish brown boy who was out there but seemed happy. She smiled warmly when she said this. It was as if the smile had escaped. Then she explained that a month before Larry was killed, he had begun dressing up. He wore high heels, makeup, and earrings to school. By Mariah's account, Larry was often teased and called names like gay and fag. Yes, Larry would react to the teasing, sometimes taunting in return, but Mariah thought such rejoinders were always provoked. Ms. Fox shifted her questions and her focus to the accused murderer. Mariah told us that she shared 2 classes, PE and English, with the defendant, Brandon McInerney. Mariah recounted how she had observed Brandon, along with her other classmates, teasing Larry. Careful to include Brandon in a group, Mariah did not name Brandon as a lone bully. She did not even have a clear recollection of seeing Brandon and Larry interact one-to-one. Mariah glanced at Brandon. Just as quickly she returned her gaze to her hands, worrying a tissue in her lap. She smiled. Again the smile quivered and was quickly checked. Miss Fox asked if kids said things to Larry like, "You're so gay, why do you dress like a girl?" Mariah quietly answered yes. She dared another look at Brandon. Moving quickly, as we would learn was her style, Miss Fox turned to the day of the murder, February 12, 2008, and the classroom at E.O. Green Junior High where the murder took place. Using an aerial diagram of the school, Miss Fox asked Mariah to identify the classroom and to confirm where she had been sitting on the morning in question. Mariah hesitated, and Miss Fox repeated the question. As Mariah pointed to the diagram, she began to cry. Sheriff Anton offered tissues and water. Mariah took the tissues, leaving the water bottle unopened on the edge of the witness stand. Calmed, she went ahead to describe how 28 students had started off the day together in their homeroom, where they stayed for about 15 minutes before walking together to the computer lab to work on research papers. Mariah's paper was about Anne Frank. 20 minutes after the class had settled into the computer lab, Mariah turned away from her computer to ask a friend a question. "What did you see? What happened?" Miss Fox asked. Mariah looked sidelong at Brandon, then back at Miss Fox, who repeated the question. Mariah lowered her head. Her shoulder-length, red blonde hair fell forward. She attempted to push it back, but strands of hair caught in the corners of her mouth. Mariah was by then 17 years old. It was not difficult, though, to see her at 14, her age, when she watched 14-year-old Brandon become a murderer and 15-year-old Larry leave life. Flushed with emotion, caught in the magnifying lens of the witness stand, Mariah began to tremble. Terror emerged from her eyes and unfurled across her body. She was not alone. When Mariah entered the room, she brought murder with her. It was with us all. One juror, a trim elderly man, leaned forward and put his head in his hands. 2 jurors wept. To my right, Brandon's mother, Brandon McInerney, sobbed. She held a tissue to her nose, but it had given way and her hands were wet. She struggled to breathe. As her gasp accelerated, I began to think through the medical response to a panic attack. I thought we might need a small brown paper bag. Someone in the visitors' gallery said no, not loudly enough to fill the room, but loudly enough to breach the court's instructed silence. The court reporter bowed her head. Larry's grandmother put her hand on her forehead and then reached out to touch the shoulder of Larry's younger brother, Rocky. Miss Fox offered Mariah a break. She asked if Mariah might want to move her chair so that her back would be turned to Brandon. Mariah did not respond. Judge Campbell ordered a 20-minute recess. Time would be reset. His order was kind but firm. He explained that when the proceedings reconvened, one of Mariah's parents would join her on the stand. He then excused her, and Sheriff Anton helped her exit the witness stand and walk to her parents, who met her at the gate that separated the well from the gallery. Looking frightened, Mariah's father put her arm around her and led her from the room. Brandon had remained motionless throughout Mariah's testimony, head down, shoulders loose. He stared at the edge of the table and at a water bottle that he occasionally tipped on its side. After the recess was called, he rose from his chair with his defense team. He turned to face the visitors' gallery as the jurors filed out. He stood with his hands folded as if he were in a receiving line. The pose looked coached. So too had Brandon's long brown hair been coached and combed in the manner of an Eton schoolboy. His social performance was as new and stiff as his shoes. The following week, Samantha Kreiner, Brandon's girlfriend, would testify that she had never seen him with long hair. "Gosh, he's never looked like that," she exclaimed. "I always wanted to see him with long hair, but he never would, buzzed. It was always buzzed." Brandon was a handsome boy. Most everyone said so. He was pale, prison porcelain, with gray eyes shadowed by a strong brow. His small chin, his thin mouth, it could have been drawn with 2 quick pencil strokes, were just the right amount of flaw. At 6'3", he towered over his lawyers. His muscles pushed against the seams of his extra-large shirt that sought to cover the evidence. 2 deputies escorted Brandon from the courtroom to his holding cell. I walked to the bathroom. I went to the sink and began splashing my face with cold water. I put my glasses back on and looked in the mirror, taking in my short gray hair and the bags under my eyes. A thin man, I am often taken to be younger than I am. But as I looked at my reflection, I did not see much that spoke of youth. I thought about my father's father, who was 57 years old when I was born. In my eyes, he had always been old. I was then 57 as I stood in front of the mirror. I was 10 when my grandfather died. His death was my first. I'd had to be ushered from the funeral in tears. As I stood at the sink, Zeke Barlow, the reporter from the Ventura County Star, came in, used the urinal, washed his hands, and began to pace. Zeke, whom I had met the day before, looked at me and asked, "Dude, you all right?" "Barely," I said. An elderly gentleman unknown to me walked to the urinal, and as if he were speaking to himself or rhetorically to the room, the stranger asked, "How could he?"
No, it's okay. I don't know if it's okay. I like I'm perched here. Ken's book is so riveting. I mean, I will say this a bunch of times tonight, but if you don't have it, you need to get it and read it right now. I kind of want to hear you read the whole thing in a marathon out loud, but it's long. So I think that when Ken was thinking about talking to me tonight, I'm not totally sure, but that he might have been familiar with the Argonauts, which has more to do with gender and sexuality. But it turns out I have this courtroom book that I wrote in 2007, which is being re-released, and so I thought I would read just a little bit from it. Because I was just saying to Ken before we started, there was just it was really interesting my book's more personal throughout. Because it's a murder in my family, than it is journalistic, or But I feel like there were just so many overlaps between the things that I feel like that his book goes into, and that I thought about during my experience of this trial. So I'll just read a little bit, but just to kind of set this up, my mother's sister Jane was murdered in 1969 when she was a student at University of Michigan, and the murder was unsolved for my whole life. I was born shortly after her death, and then but was thought to be the work of a serial killer. And then I wrote a book about it called Jane, a Murder, because it was just a big, unsolved, traumatic thing hanging in my family and kind of pulsating. So I wrote this book, Jane, a Murder, but then right as the book... And my worst fear while writing it, which was like my cinematic fear, was that dredging up this family story was going to somehow like awaken her real murderer, And then right when the book was going to print, we got a call from the Michigan State Police saying that there was a new DNA match in her case 36 years later, and that they actually were on the verge of arresting a new suspect for my aunt's murder. So this book is the story of my mother and I going to the trial of the suspect, Gary Leiterman. But Ken and I we're talking real briefly in email about this phenomenon called murder mind, and I thought I'd read a little bit from this first chapter called Murder Mind. So we're just kind of jumping in the middle here. Years later, while in the thick of researching and writing my book, Jane, the problem was not too little information. It was too much. Not about Jane. Her murder remained maddeningly opaque. But about the other girls, this is the other 7 girls who were thought to be part of that series, whose horrific rapes and murders were described in excruciating detail in newspapers from the period, several true crime books, and on many serial killer chic websites. There were charts, such as the one that appeared in the Detroit Free Press on July 28, 1969, titled A Pattern of Death, an Anatomy of 7 Brutal Murders, which organized the details under the categories last seen, where found, how killed, other injuries. The entries were barely readable. During this research, I began to suffer from an affliction I came to call murder mind. I could work all day on my project with a certain distance, blithely looking up bullet or skull in my rhyming dictionary. But in bed at night, I found a smattering of sickening images of violent acts ready and waiting for me. Reprisals of the violence done unto Jane, unto the other Michigan murder girls, unto my loved ones, unto myself, and sometimes, most horribly, done by me. These images coursed through my mind at random intervals, but always with the slapping, prehensile force of the return of the repressed. I persevered, mostly because I had been given an endpoint, the publication of Jane, a Murder, on my 32nd birthday. As soon as I held the book in my hand, I would be released. I would move on to new projects that had nothing to do with sexual murder. I would never look back. The reopening of Jane's case did away with these hopes entirely. So I moved to this terrible town called Middletown in Connecticut, and as winter descended in Middletown, the sunroom became the snow room, and Murder Mind came back. In the morning, I would pretend to know how to teach Shakespeare to fresh-faced undergraduates, and then return home to talk on the phone to homicide cops and sift through the stack of books I had checked out from the university's science library to try to keep up with developments in Jane's case. DNA for Dummies, clinical psychology textbooks with titles like, you're going to have to help me here, Sexual Murder, Catathymic and Compulsive Homicides. Catathymic. I flipped through the case studies in sexual murder only once, but I still felt as though they might have given me a fatal disease. At night, I often found myself up late, unable to sleep, pacing around the Ponderosa room in my pale blue bathrobe, a tinkling glass of whiskey and ice in my hand, watching the snow mount menacingly around the windows. I began to feel like a ghost, like a stranger to myself. It wasn't quite as bad as The Shining, but sometimes it felt close. At least Jack Nicholson had a family to witness and rue his descent. At more jocular moments, I felt like John Berryman, a throwback, a poet trapped in a Gothic college town, some scraggly miscreant academic who went to dreary parties, swapped wives, and occasionally defecated blind drunk on a colleague's lawn. Except that in Middletown, there were no such parties. In short, the ideal of catharsis that had served as a naive but real spur throughout my writing of Jane began to crack at the seams and reveal itself as the ruse I had always suspected it to be. My identification with my aunt, which had been the main thread of Jane, and which was arguably a result of mistaken identity on the part of my grandfather, who has called me Jane instead of Maggie for as long as I can remember, began to feel like either a hoax or a horror. I had started writing Jane with the presumption that my family's repression of her awful death was an example of faulty grieving, which my book could delicately expose as an unhealthy vestige of a Midwestern Scandinavian heritage, a grim Ingmar Bergman scenario getting played out in the small lakeside town of Muskegon, Michigan, and I could offer a more successful model of mourning in its place. The hubris of this idea is now abundantly clear to me. When I think now about faulty or successful grieving, I feel only bewilderment. And beyond the bewilderment, the edge of a shapeless, potent rage, a rollicking protest, some loose, hot, and wild event starting to take place under my skin. Photo number 1. This book has kind of a series of photos from the trial that punctuate it. Photo number 1. A ring of male detectives standing around the shrouded lump of Jane's dead body, taken from behind the chain-link fence looking into Denton Cemetery. The picture cuts off around the men's waists, so all you can see of them is a row of trench coat bottoms and matching black shoes. Jane's body lies at their feet, her head and upper body shrouded by her raincoat. One of her arms strays out from under it, ghostly white, flung above her head, as if she were not dead, just completely exhausted. So I'll just read that. Maybe. It's going to be a real heavy subject matter of these books, but that's partly what I think. Yeah, what you just read about the way that it's so moving to begin your book that way, because that feeling of, murder entered the room with her. It's Mariah, is that?
Right.
Yeah, it's so recognizable and palpable to me.
Yeah. The first day of the trial was testimony offered by men in authority. They all wore suits and ties.
Yeah.
And they brought, binders, 3-ring binders with them, and detailed facts of the murder.
Yeah.
In a way that she was the first person to actually bring the murder into the room.
Yeah.
I wondered if we might just start with your question about faulty grieving.
Yeah.
Because while in fact I don't at all disagree with what you just had to say about grieving. I think we operate with ideas about grief and grieving that are too tidy, and we tend to think of grief and grieving as something that happens in a discrete way and in a discrete period of time, and then we move on. It is neither my personal or my professional experience that is the case. And it is interesting to me how that idea keeps threading through your book at various times. And in my book, though, part of, I think, both my intention, but also how it captured me in attending the trial were the ways in which Larry, who had begun to rename himself Leticia, the way in which Leticia's life within the court was a life that in many ways was not seen as a life that mattered, or a life that could be recognized, and a life that mattered, and therefore a life that could not be grieved. And so it's the theme of grief runs through both of these books in a variety of different ways, and that of course would make sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in the beginning of the Red Parts, and I have that passage about faulty grieving and saying that I don't believe in catharsis. But I mean, I think that if I think that the book ends up somewhere different, than where it starts. It kind of starts in this rage of like that there is no healing and there is no, it's just kind of this boiling thing. And I think that what's really interesting about maybe this actually is a question I have so many questions. I don't know where to start, but or comments or whatever. But I think that one thing about the structure of your book, Ken, is that I felt like it began. It too takes this very motley and thorough journey and through these different places, but it as a writer, maybe I'll just start here as a kind of writerly question, which was that I felt like that because it has to do with grieving, was that you're rendering. I mean, there are a lot of I'll just say, even though it's not really proper, but I felt very, very kind of despicable people or actions reverberating throughout A Murder Over a Girl, in terms of the what made Leticia's life not visible and what made it end, and all of the forces and familial and institutional that contributed to that. So it's a very enraging reading to see her life denied. And I think at a certain point in the book, Ken kind of says, name it, name the hate that will be I can't remember what you say, allow us to
name the crime that ended her life, and thereby recognize her life.
Yeah, and so I think but the journey that your book takes. So I thought, as a writer, because I thought, occasionally when you were rendering interviews with people, I thought wow, he's really letting himself just be really hard on these people, and I was really kind of amazed, because it's really difficult when you're doing kind of interviews where you're not precisely a journalist or you're not precisely a memoirist. You really know what you're doing. You're just hey, can I interview you? And then you end up writing about he was wearing a dark sage corduroy shirt, and they're that wasn't what I signed up for. But then by the end, you at least allow the figure, at least of Brandon's mother, which has a very long visit with her at the end. I'm not going to call it redemption, but it's kind of one of the first very, very real interactions where there feels like some change or something has happened that has brought some kind of reckoning to anybody, yourself included. And I wondered whether or not, I guess as a writer, bless you, how you approached both writing about those other people and then the question of that journey about reckoning with.
I guess I have a couple of different thoughts. It's interesting for you to hear you say that I'm hard on them, because I actually didn't feel that.
Yeah.
It was a question that Tony Kushner asked me in New York when he said he went at it from a different direction, saying he thought that I was too nice to them, and that why wasn't I yelling at them more, and he spoke of them as horrible people.
Yeah.
And I said that I actually didn't think of them as horrible people.
Yeah.
I actually thought of them as people that I was sitting at a table with or in their office, and I was trying to understand their point of view. And oftentimes it was a point of view that was being offered within a system that was just failing colossally. And in many ways my anger, at least during the trial, I saved it for the systemic problems that were at hand. So I found that the teachers' responses in the school to Larry Leticia were really lacking, whereas the children in the school were the most remarkable witnesses and the most remarkable people to speak to, I found. But the school system was just crumbling around these teachers. They were bringing papers and pencils to school because there were none. It was a school designed for 600 kids, and at the time of the murder, there were 1,000 students at that school. And so, I, at one point at the end of the book, I quote the Prince of Verona, who at the end of Romeo and Juliet stands in the middle of the courtyard and says, "All are punished." And in many ways, that was the feeling that I had. But what happened with Brandon's mother at the end was a gift. It was just one of those, like a lucky, very, very lucky moments as a writer. I happened to be at an event with Joan Didion. Undertaking this project was an incredible act of hubris in so many ways. But I was at this event with Joan Didion. I told her I was going to do this. I asked her for advice, and she said to me, "Make yourself as small as possible." And in many ways, that is what I did. And over time, people came up that this trial also had lasted for 2 months. And so we were all there together every day. And so we got to know one another. We got to know one another's habits. Kendra and I knew that we could never find our cars in the parking lot at the end of the day. Dawn King knew that she could make me laugh.
Well, what's so amazing about nonfiction, though, is that there are certain, even though you do in some ways make yourself as small as possible, there also, I don't want to give too much away, but there also kind of begins to be this strange thread through that, Brandon, who's the murderer, who won't, I don't know what to say, he won't crack, he won't touch what he's done. He's just, as you just saw him playing with the water bottle half on the side, he's just in some sense vacated. He's gone, and like he says, I put Larry somewhere. I put him away. The person he murdered, as if it solved the problem and it's gone. But there becomes to be this thread that, if Brandon would only talk to Ken, maybe he would be able, if he would put the repository of his story of what he did to somebody, maybe it would actually be his salvation is not quite the right word, but something might give in his psychology. I thought that was really interesting because then by the very end, you kind of actually become up. But what was so great about nonfiction, I was going to say, is that we can't make things happen in other people. All we can do is bear testimony to what happened. And, of course, you don't speak with Brandon, but you do have this scene with his mother. And I don't know, I thought I felt you because I felt this before in nonfiction writing, especially in a trial where you're waiting for a verdict and you're writing about the trial. You kind of also know that your charge is going to be to making the story is whatever the story is, and your job as a writer is to render it however it was. So I will know if you want to say anything about, the process of the verdict, or this question of Brandon speaking to you or not, or how these kind of narrative threads felt when you knew that you were not in control of them.
Well, I actually think that goes to the question of trauma and what is testimony. And I think testimony is a desperate attempt to try to collect the shards of a glass that has dropped, and it is just in shards, and you cannot ever bring it back together again. And so in many ways, witnessing and testimony is that effort to try to bring something back. For me, one of the most moving moments in the entire trial was a boy who was sitting 2 seats away from Leticia at the time of the murder. He was a very serious kid, or I don't know if he was a serious kid or his mother or his grandmother had made him look serious. He was in a starched shirt and these very stiff pants, and his hair was combed just so. But he was a very sober boy, and he spoke about watching Brandon stand up and shoot Larry. He couldn't remember exactly seeing the shooting itself, but he then did. Although he recognized that he had seen it, but he wasn't able to recall that in his mind. And the next thing he recalled was watching Brandon walk out a door and walk out onto a crowded street with cars going by. And he said from the witness stand with his head, I don't know if I can actually do it, he went like this, and then he looked down and he said, but it wasn't until the next day that my brother told me there are no houses, there are no cars outside that door. And the way in which trauma had just taken his mind elsewhere. But that was his testimony, that was his effort to try to make sense of that which he could not make sense of.
I think that's why, in some ways, I remember when I was titling the red parts, I almost titled it The Book of Shells, because that's the name of the log of where you buy bullets, you write your name in the book of shells. But it was also that, like, after the murder, and ironically, or whatever, coincidentally, both of the murders that Ken and I are writing about have to do with being shot in the head. And so there's a kind of recovery of bullet fragments. And then the book of shells was also kind of like, like at this trial that I was at, there's the literal passing around to the jury of the recollected, the recollected fragments. And in this case, because they were 36 years old, it was really quite strange to be like, here was the tampon this person had in her body, saved 36 years. Here are the bullet shards taken from her skull 36 years later. But again, so on the one hand, yes, you have this tremendous recollection around trauma that
like an archive.
Yeah, that the trial does. But then on the other hand, as your book makes clear, and as you've just made clear, there's such a huge disconnect between this kind of clinical recitation of what happened and then where the actual trauma lives. And I don't know, maybe it kind of brings me to this other question I had, which I know is an unanswerable question, which your book just...
Can I ask you one first?
Yeah. Okay.
Because it has to do with this idea of murder mind, which I got really, really involved in when I was reading your book. And I write at some length about what it's like to imagine your mind into the mind of another, which is actually something I do every day, hour by hour. But in a courtroom, I was left to do it with multiple people at multiple times. And part of what I was left to do was to put myself in the mind of a murderer. But I kind of found that I went at it from the murdered to the murderer. And I wondered which position you found yourself. I don't think it was that discreet, but I did have moments. I was swimming at one point of time, and I was pushing my head against a tile wall when I was taking a break. And it wasn't until I was in my fourth lap that I realized I had been trying to imagine what it was like to be shot in the back of the head. And you write about similar things, but you don't write so much about the mind of the murderer. And I actually think you have a healthy respect for certainly a healthy respect for what you could and could not know, and also I think a healthy suspicion about the nature of justice.
Yeah, I think it's hard because I think that in my book, because it's a kind of feminist saga of like, if you grow up and you have a family member who's been murdered in this way, a woman, and she's been murdered because she was not because, it's not why she was murdered, but under the circumstances of which she took a ride from a ride board at college in the late 60s when it wasn't entirely common for, she was only the fourth female law student at University of Michigan. It wasn't entirely common for somebody to be out in the public sphere, much less getting a ride home from a stranger, right? So if you have all that, though, and then you're growing up, as I did, under the shadow of kind of the kind of chronic menace of what might happen to a young female body, that is very easy to imagine. The menace and the harm. And although I too had, I mean, it's very hard. When you were talking, I got like a chill because I was like remembering, and I'm really grateful not to be there now. So I don't know if any of you have been there, but it's very hard to put myself back into in a way. But this Murder Mind place is not a place I normally live. When I was working on this project, I had a lot of ideations about, I mean, the whole project about my aunt started because I had a series of dreams about being shot in the head. And I'd forgotten that's how my aunt died. And I was telling them to a friend, I was saying, I keep dreaming that there's like light coming out of my head, the front and the back. And she was like, isn't that how your aunt died? She was, shot in the front and then in the back of the head. And I was kind of like, oh, like I can't even believe that my unconscious just told me that. And then it became something I felt like I had to deal with. But I think that so starting from there, and then, I think that I moved in my book through a lot of, like, I had a lot of dreams about murdering him, about like rage, kind of like whatever, rape, revenge fantasies, like that kind of rage. But his just random murdering of a woman you picked up, I don't know, like it isn't any place I could go. I actually felt like in your book it was, Brandon's life is so miserable, and as the jacket copy says, he was kind of the transmission about guns and the transmission about how you solve a problem through violence, and the fact that I can't remember what it is. What his mother shot his father. His father shot his mother prior to Brandon's birth. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And then there was there was a certain kind of. I hesitate to say, but you can even see it in like the Donald Trump rally phenomenon. You can see this kind of like, you can feel the forces gathering, and you can feel the scariness and like the kind of sickness of it. And I could feel that in your book in a way that I have had a harder time conjuring with just kind of ad hoc misogynistic violence. Yes. Yeah. And I think what we see in the Trump rallies, I don't know if you guys have followed the story today, but there was a rally in Chicago that they had to cancel. But what we see is that bullying becomes a mode of discourse, if we can call it that. That's to elevate it beyond that which what it is. But that was the kind of life that Brandon did grow up in, where there was a lot of bullying, there was a lot of hate that circulated, a lot of hateful speech, and a lot of guns. There were 15 guns in the house when they went to search that afternoon. But one of the most remarkable things about your book is the way that, and you know this from your practice and from research and other things, but you say this over and over again, that this whole like boys will be boys or abused boys will exhibit this behavior is not borne out statistically, and that it's actually incredibly rare for what Brandon to actually, for someone to actually go in and actually take a life, not to mention a 14-year-old boy. And I think, I think that in the book there's one of my favorite parts and one of the most I think difficult parts of the book which is the whole kind of hate crime discussion, which we can get into maybe, but is where there are all these pictures of Brandon's that are being discussed on the stand, and you guys can look at these drawings. But what was so interesting about them in part is that I have two young boys in my house that I'm raising, and they don't draw swastikas, but this thing that you describe between the analysis of like young boys' drawings, and to me, because you could replace. There are just so many things going on in those that they just don't. I think what's so interesting is the way that you show the conflagration of factors that are causing these drawings, while at the same time showing like these drawings, or these feelings do not, in many, many, many cases, lead on a step-by-step basis to this action, and that to me was very reassuring about the population, but also left a lot of questions. So.
Well, I think the boys will be boys psychology is bankrupt, frankly. It's a bankrupt psychology. So if Brandon tried to recruit other people to join him in attacking their other boys, they all declined. They all came to the witness stand, and each in their own ways were quite adamant adamant that Larry had never done anything that would warrant even beating him up. So they were actually quite horrified at Brandon's actions. But the defense, in a very cunning twist of logic, turned the tables such that Brandon was the bullied and Leticia was the bully. And the consequence, or the motive for the murder, was that Brandon had been driven in the heat of passion to kill Leticia because he had felt sufficiently harassed by her, even though not one child came to the witness stand and could recount a moment of harassment, nor could a teacher. But it leaned very heavily on this idea of boys being boys. It also leaned very heavily on the idea that a gender transformation is a sexual embodiment, and Larry was 15, and Leticia was a sexually curious girl, but there was no place in this school for either gender or sex or sexuality to be an opportunity for education. It was actually to be stopped, and ultimately Leticia was stopped. And again, I found myself kept going. Maybe that was the way I protected myself, but it did feel to me like a real system problem, a very serious one, both educationally and psychologically.
I mean, the problem is that like all system problems, it's a system problem, but you see it in your book play out with individual people. So the sole teacher who instructs the students to stop bullying, Leticia is a lesbian who then is pilloried for promoting the gay agenda. Again, I mean, with the slippage between between sexuality and gender here, I'm just rehearsing the total confusion throughout the school. And then you also have, like as you said, the complete reversal where you even have psychologists. I think it's Hoagland, I can't remember, being willing to testify to say that, like, asking, if it even happened, asking Brandon to be Leticia's Valentine would be equivalent to, to sexual harassment or beating him up for, X number of days to elicit this response.
Right. And that is the narrative, the motive, the motive narrative, or the narrative motive that developed very quickly after the murder. But there wasn't one person who could come to the witness stand and actually tell us that they had heard Larry ask Brandon to be his Valentine. It was all hearsay. And that story still lives, even though there was no evidence presented.
And then I was going to say also, I forgot that about individual people, that then what you're saying about the boys of being entirely bankrupt, and yet the movement, the Free Brandon, we support Brandon, wear your bracelet for Brandon movement, to me what was very chilling and a good reminder about that was that, it seemed like it was, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed very spearheaded by women and women on the jury to kind of protect this boy's behavior, which was a real deep reminder of the ways in which both genders can be exceedingly complicit and enforcing nefarious conditions.
Yeah. I went to the trial with Gail Solomon, who's a professor at Princeton. She's working on a book on the rhetoric of the law and the body. And I remember turning to Gail, who always sat to my left, one day after we'd been there for a couple of weeks, and I remember saying to her, "Do you think anybody in this room has even read Betty Friedan?" I mean, just basic sort of, we're not talking sort of sophisticated or particularly, theory-driven feminism, but it had not found its way into that room.
Yeah, and I guess I know that we're supposed to have you guys ask questions too, but but you said something about about in my book with this, ambivalence about justice, and I guess I just wanted to say that another thing I really respect about your book is that And this, I was thinking about this because it's so important with, whether it's like Black Lives Matter or about police brutality or other things, but, the difficulty of the fact that, like, even in Black Lives Matter or something, and in your book as well, like, as we are witness to terrible injustice, and as we want, as you're feeling palpably and palpably that somebody must be brought to accountability and somebody must be punished, but the discourse about hate crimes, of course, and the discourse about is that what you're asking for is longer prison terms, and you're also up against the fact, and even anti-racist movements know this, and that prison doesn't help, right? So you want so badly for this reckoning, and you want justice to be served, and yet, as we're moving in your book closer and closer, and you're just like, God damn it, they cannot let this person off with the boys will be boys thing for his actions, and then you're also up against, wow, am I going to feel really great if he gets 80 years as a juvenile? What the hell? I don't know if you want to speak to that at all, but it's...
I was quite clear. I am quite clear that trying him as an adult is psychologically bankrupt and an ethical lapse. And so I think what I had to do during the trial was, in some way, absent myself from questions of sentencing.
Yeah.
I think it's why the sentencing was so hard for me.
Yeah.
Because knowing that there is no rehabilitation and there is no juvenile justice system in place such that a 14-year-old with this pattern of behavior and engaging in what in the law is called the worst thing you can do, that there is no way within the prison system to help him. There is no rehabilitation. And so if he had been tried as a juvenile, he would have been released at 21. And one of the things that was most convincing to me, or I don't even know if convincing is the right word, but sobering, was when the district attorney said to me, well, would you want him living next door to you? And I had to say that no, I would not. And so... how do we grapple with the fact that here we have a young person who has, I think, a serious mental illness, of an illness of character, not an illness of a psychotic nature or a mood disorder. But if he were an adult, we would be speaking of him as a sociopath. And then what do we do with a young person who we understand to be this way, and that we don't have, the system has no place for such a person. And so I think what I had to do during the trial was act as if I didn't know that, just to keep going. And I got very focused on just wanting the crime named. I just wanted the crime named.
And by that, for those of you who haven't read Ken's book, it has to do with, that, that the hate crime discussion in and around Brandon's actions were all being tied to like white supremacy and these different things, but actually race and transphobia and these things were entirely exiled from the courtroom. It could only be being homophobic in a way that could be tied to a white supremacist organization, so far as I understood it. So which just took all the kind of main things that were going on out of the room, which was kind of defies intersectional reason, Do you think we should let...
I think we should.
Okay.
Yeah. While you were going to the trial, I forget what prompted you to do this. A lot of time out of your life and a big commitment.
Yeah, like I said, I think it was an act of hubris. Really seriously, on one level. On another level, I read about Larry's memorial right at the time that I was finishing my last book, and I got really curious about this story about two boys, one of whom was right from the beginning being spoken of as a normal boy, and the other was up to, to use Judith Butler's phrase, some gender trouble. And I was really interested in the ways in which this story was going to be told. And thanks to my Oxnard mole, Chris Clarkin, who's right here in the front row, I started to follow the trial through the Ventura County Star. And Chris went to many of the pretrial hearings and would report back to me. And slowly I started to collect information, and slowly it built into a book project.
Did you have it? Did you know that you were going to do it as a book when you went out there? Was that the,
Yeah,
was
that I did know, yeah.
I know a lot of victims' parents, like Matthew Shepard or Tyler Clementi's parents, go on to do advocacy in their names. Am I correct that in Larry and Leticia's situation, that doesn't seem like it's going to be the case? And if so, do you think that your project is something like that, or is there anyone else out there who is advocating on behalf of this person who's lost?
I think that's a really good question. In New York, when I did one of these events, Tony Kushner asked me about the artifacts that allowed me to imagine Leticia, because in many ways she was never brought to life in the courtroom. And actually the artifacts that allowed me to bring her to life were artifacts that were given to me either through description or through photographs or through recordings that Dawn and Greg King gave to me. Now, Dawn and Greg King, Larry's adoptive parents, who he had moved out of their home 2 months prior to his death, having alleged abuse that was never actually documented or confirmed by the Bureau of Child Welfare. But I could bring Leticia to life through what Greg and Dawn gave to me. And so even though they don't see the story the way I tell the story, in many ways, they did give me the materials to work with. I sent them a book a week ago, and I don't know what will happen in relation to that. But no, they haven't set up anything akin to what Tyler Clementi's parents have done, or Matthew Shepard's parents. Although Greg King was talking about wanting to lobby the California legislature in order to have school shootings, when there was a school shooting, that the sentence for the shooter would be increased by 1 year for every child in the classroom, in accord with the trauma that those kids had suffered. But I don't know as he's ever really followed up on that.
This is something I actually have never thought of before, and despite our conversations about your process of sitting and then listening to everything. But did you ever sense, or in the aftermath as you were interviewing people, the kids were like 14 when it happened, basically, around 17 testifying.
Right.
Yeah. So they've come into another level of sort of sexual self-maturity.
Right.
And I was wondering if there were ways in which gender sexual ambiguities amongst those other high schoolers were set into motion by this murder of a kid undergoing his or her own confusions. In other words, did you sense there were other, maybe possibly queer kids who were more traumatized or
Yes.
more open by?
I think both. There was a queer boy and a queer girl. And some of you may know that Marcia Cunningham made a documentary about the murder called Valentine Road, and she spends quite a bit of time with the girl whose name is also Mariah. And there's a boy named Kino who speaks with her. But they were not in the classroom, either of those kids. And the kids who I worked with and talked to I just stayed with who came into the court. And so but that is a really interesting question. But Mariah was actually, not the Mariah I write about, but the other Mariah, was, I think, in some ways, engendered, if you will, to come out as trans herself.
When Brandon is arrested and his parents come to the police station and they're just about to leave, and Brandon asks if James, his brother, knows about it, and his mother goes, "Oh God, thank God, no." Brandon says, "Tell him no one will fall." And I might be totally off base, but to me that seems like he's basically saying that he's going to take the rap for an execution that was planned with James and or this Mr. I don't know how to pronounce it.
Riom.
I mean, and that didn't pop up anywhere else in your book. I'm just wondering if at the trial the prosecutor used that at all, because I certainly would have if I was.
Right.
Or am I off base?
No, you're not off. Right, you're not off. What they did try to work with was the idea that Brandon undertook the murder in part, almost in the spirit of a gang initiation. So an initiation within the local white supremacist organization, which was tagged the SSL, or the Silver Strand Locals. The problem from a legal perspective was that the SSL had never been stepped up within legal process. If you get charged with a gang enhancement, someone from that gang would have already had to have been arrested and convicted of a capital crime, and no one had been. So legally, they didn't really have the grounds to work from with regard to that. But it is a very curious statement. And James, in an interview that I do with him after the trial, does suggest that he thought that Brandon was involved in a kind of vigilante fantasy. And he talks about this movie called Boondock Saints, where I did the math at one point. I think there are 4 people killed every minute or something like that. But these two Irish brothers who go on a vigilante hunt, killing people in their community who have done bad things. So James was operating with a theory that Brandon had killed Larry because Larry was a sexual predator.
Ken, I'm sorry about your laryngitis.
Thanks.
But I would like to ask you a legal question.
Sure.
You can answer yes or no. You don't have to.
Right.
You don't have to expound. But do you recognize me?
I don't know as I do. And I should, I guess, right? And you are?
I was one of the 3 males on the jury.
Oh. Wow, you've changed quite a bit.
It was a man older than I.
Yes, of course. Yes, now when you took off your hat, yes. Yeah, wow. Yes. Wow.
But the question that was just asked right there by this lady.
Oh my gosh, it's so amazing that you're here.
We were never allowed to hear or see that taped part of that interchange that happened in the juvenile police department with the father and with the policeman. We heard it happen, but we were never allowed to hear that statement that you just said. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. Gosh, it's remarkable that you're here.
An emotional, significant experience. I'm sure.
I'm sure.
I'll never forget it.
I'm sure.
And I thank you for writing the book. I probably broke the law going to the local bookstore as fast as I could to buy it. And I'm a little in wonder that there aren't more people here that were part of it.
Yeah, I heard from several of them. It was hard for them to get here from Ventura at this time of day.
Some people that I disagree with that really got publicity on 2020.
Yeah, definitely. Yes, and yes. And I made a decision because they took a public stand, and I explained this in the book, that this 7 people who voted for voluntary manslaughter took a public stand to go public and to speak publicly, and the 5 people who voted for first-degree murder did not. That I was going to treat it then. What I was going to do with the jury at that point was only work with that which was public. But I would love to talk with you now. Yeah, definitely. And it was a...
And I think that the jury was well protected through the whole trial.
I do too.
And I don't know whether you're aware of it, or maybe I shouldn't even say it, but one of the jury members, her own husband.
Yes, I am aware of that. Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
I just always wondered what her thought about that was.
Yes.
compared to the way she thought about
Yes.
Brandon.
Yes. Right. Wow. It's remarkable that you're here. Really remarkable.
Thank you again for writing the book.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. It was a really very traumatic period of time. I spent a lot of time reading about trauma. I would go back to my hotel room and order books on Amazon about trauma and read them.
At least you got to talk to Alex a lot.
Oh, that was incredible, right?
Place to be.
Yeah. He's referring to a kid where I would go and swim on the weekends, who was a brown boy who was Larry's age, who I formed this sort of friendship of a sort with, and he was like my everyday. He was my everyman in the book, and very valuable in that way.
Are you familiar with Jay Mathene's one-man show about young gay men?
Yes.
Detective Marine Day.
Yeah.
Is that just a coincidence that there was kind of a thematic similarity, or did his play happen before the Oxnard incident or afterwards, or are they just two independent?
He's talking about a play called The Absolute Brightness of Leonard Pelkey. It actually happened after, and James, who's a friend of mine, actually knew quite a bit about what I was working on, and started to work with ideas about hate crime after I had talked with him about it. Yeah. There was a question in the...
I was just thinking about, in terms of trauma, the kids who you had interviewed, was it some of their first time speaking with a therapist? What was that like? I was curious what that was like for you, and did that result in, for them, any ongoing treatment with other people?
Right. That was not only true for them, that was true for most everyone. And so... Kendra McInerney, Brandon's mother, referred to me as Dr. Ken, and I don't write about this in the book. I wrote quite a bit about it, and I ended up taking it out because it got a little too abstract. It was really important for me to write this book as a story. I wanted it to be a story, first and foremost a story. I'm an academic. I come from a very academic background and have written mostly very academic things. But my target reader for this book was a mother who read The New Yorker. The ideas that I've been educated with and I live in should sort of seep through the story, but they're never on the surface or very rarely. But I did at one point try to write about the fact that I am a psychologist after all. I am often in a position of listening. What was my ethical responsibility in this position? And I would introduce myself to people as a psychologist, and I discussed it with them. Whether or not they were able to have a thoughtful response, or to reflect on what it is that was happening between us. Every person said to me, "That's okay. I'm so relieved to actually have someone to talk to, and that I want you to have this information," including Brandon's mother, where at the end of the book there's a kind of almost Ford Maddox Ford moment where you begin to see the ways in which various things that the defense was up to were really quite unethical.
Was it hard as a psychologist? I mean, psychology doesn't come off exceedingly well in the trial, to say the least.
Yeah.
I don't know. I kept thinking, okay, so there's the good Dr. Ken over here, and then there's the parade of, whatever, monstrous, homophobic, I mean, all that stuff about disassociation and, how you, the kind of, cliche of making up these various DSM things that basically just could be associated with anybody who does anything, that, anybody who fires a gun and kills someone in front of them is probably not going to remember the 5 seconds afterwards, but the idea that if you didn't, then that meant you were, all that. I don't know. How did you feel sitting in there with all that?
That was the hardest chapter for me to write.
Right.
Oh, man, I had to work on it for a very long time, and my editor kept sending it back to me with various things crossed out.
Yeah.
I actually thought the psychologist could have made a case for the role that dissociation undoubtedly played in Brandon's life over a cumulative period of time. Right. Any human who grows up in a context of the kind of violence that he grew up in, their mind, it becomes cratered through that kind of violence. And undoubtedly, his was a mind made through violence and through quite open expressions of hate. I actually thought that the defense psychologist could have made his case better, but apparently he didn't need to. There were quite a few members of the jury who accepted his claim of dissociation, or that the murder happened in a state of dissociation, even though Brandon himself, what's the word I want? He doesn't confirm that, he discounts it or discredits it because the classroom teacher screamed in between the first and second shot, and he has a recollection of that. But then again, I don't think there really are spoiler alerts in this book. You can easily find out what happened. Just Google it. You read the book in a different spirit. One is left to wonder what Brandon actually said and what was put into his words by the psychologist in particular. And I sat there very suspicious throughout much of the trial, thinking that he sounded too adult and he sounded too articulate for a kid who was known to not talk and not have friends.
Maybe one more question.
Okay.
Okay. We get one more.
Let me make an observation.
Okay.
I anticipated a book that would be clinically precise and a narrative, if you will. I found a book that was all of that, but it was poetry. And you injected so much humanity, so much sensitivity, so much exceptional prose that I'm in awe.
Thank you. Thank you. You're going to make me cry. This is my father-in-law.
Nothing to do with it.
I think we have to have a disclaimer. But thank you very much. I really wanted to do that. I worked on this for 4 years. I feel like psychology has left the public square. Psychologists don't speak anymore other than through self-help books. And so I really wanted to find a way for a psychologist to speak and to have a place and not be just Dr. Toad from Toad Hall, which is what we called Oakland. There were lots of nicknames that circulated. I'd be very curious to know what the ones from the jury were. But it was part of the courtroom culture, right, that there were lots of nicknames. Well, thank you very much.
You've been listening to the Skylight Books Author Reading Series. Don't forget that you can listen to this and all of our other great podcasts at skylightbooks.com. Thanks again for stopping by, and we hope to see you soon.